nor a non-reality, so is the Alaya in the body not limited by the dualism of being and non-being. When a revulsion takes place, the Siddha is disengaged from turbidity. As it understands all existence, I state that the Siddha is the Buddha. Being pure or good does not always mean morally pure and good. It means rather logically pure, that is, absolutely free from the dualistic way of reasoning. Therefore, the sutra never tires of repeating that in order to realize the fact of the mind onto the realm of dualities, which is the product of false discrimination, must be transcended. False discrimination is the principle of turbidity which hides the truth from being clearly perceived. Buddhahood consists in removing this turbidity of discrimination, for the removing is emancipation and the restoring of the Siddha to its original purity. This is known in the Lankavatara as inner realization. The Siddha and the Alayavijnana and the Atman. Along with the conception of Siddha there was that of the Vijnana system, and also the deepening of the ego idea. Early Buddhists denied the reality of an ego substance, which was in accordance with their psychology, but the idea of ego was not necessarily the same as the assertion of self-will or egotism. Even when self-will was destroyed, the idea remained. What was destroyed was the lower self and not the higher self, the smaller self and not the larger self. For the annihilation of the lower and smaller self was only possible through the assertion of the higher and larger one. Buddhists never thought of putting an end to whatever might go under the name of self. The idea of ego substance was inimical to the development of the higher center of the individual, nor was it in harmony with the experience of their religious life. How is the question of the higher life to be solved, then? Where is it to be placed in the system of the Vijnanas? With this question an absolute Siddha came to be separated from the empirical ego. And this absolute Siddha to be identified with the Alaya, which was now made the foundation of the whole Vijnana group. So we have Siddham Alayavijnanam, and this then furnishes the reason of the inner realization as taking place in the Tathagata-garbha. The philosophers take the Tathagata-garbha, or the Alayavijnana for the ego, that is, the lower, narrower, empirical ego, which is, however, far from the teaching of the Buddha. The real immaculate ego, Suddhisatman, going beyond the grasp of relative knowledge, cannot so easily be understood and so readily be asserted as is done by the ignorant. We thus read, born or unborn, the mind always remains pure. Those who reason about the existence of an ego substance, why do they not prove it by illustrations? Those who vainly reason without understanding the truth are lost in the jungle of the Vijnanas, running about here and there and trying to justify their view of ego substance. The self realized in your inmost consciousness appears in its purity. This is the Tathagata-garbha, which is not the realm of those given up to mere reasoning. When the skandhas are analyzed, there is that which apprehends and that which is apprehended. By understanding this aspect of relativity, true knowledge is born. The philosophers think that the Alaya, or where the garbha is oriented, is the seat of thought and one with the self. But such are not the teachings declared by the Buddhas. When these are well discriminated, there is emancipation and seeing into the truth. By moral cultivation and intellectual training the evil passions are abandoned and made pure. The Siddha, pure in its original nature and free from the category of finite and infinite, is the undefiled Tathagata-garbha, which is wrongly apprehended by sentient beings. As the beautiful color of gold and the brilliancy of a precious stone are revealed by purification, so is the Alaya which is hidden in the skandhas revealed to sentient beings. The Buddha is neither an individual soul nor the skandhas, he is the wisdom of non-outflowings, and knowing that he is eternal quietude I take refuge in him. The Siddha, pure in its original nature, is united with the minor impurities, manas, and others, and with the ego. This is what is taught by the best of preachers. The Siddha is in its original nature pure, but the manas and others are not, and by them various karmas are accumulated, and as the result there are two sorts of impurities or defilements. On account of external defilements from the beginning less past, the pure self is contaminated. It is like a soiled garment which can be cleansed. When the garment is unsoiled, or when gold is freed of its defects, they are restored and will not be destroyed. So it is with the self when remedied qf its defects. As an unintelligent man seeks for the abode of sweet sound in the body of the lute, conch shell, or kettle drum, so does he look for a soul within the skandhas. Like the gems in the treasure house or like water under the ground, which are invisible though known to be there, so is the soul in the skandhas. While the whole system of the siddha activity with its proper functions is in union with the skandhas, the unintelligent fail to comprehend it, so it is also with the soul in the skandhas. Like the contents of the womb whose existence is known but invisible, so is with the soul in the skandhas which is likewise not perceivable to the dull-minded. As the essence of medicinal herbs, as fire hidden in fuel, so the soul in the skandhas is not perceived by the dull-minded. As the unwise fail to see that in all things existent there is the nature of eternity and emptiness, so they do not see the soul in the skandhas. If no real self exists, there will be no stages of bodhisattvahood, no self-mastery, no psychic power, no anointment of the highest order, no excellent samadhi. If the nihilist come and ask, if there be the self, show it to me, the wise one's answer will be, show me your own discrimination. Those who deny the self are the opponents of the Buddhist teaching, their views are one-sided, advocating either it is, or it is not. They are to be rejected by a general session of the bhikshus. The doctrine of the self is illuminating, it releases one from the faults of the philosophers, it burns up the forest of selflessness like the tire arising at the end of the world. In sugar, sugarcane, candy, honey, daddy, or tila oil, there is its own taste. But one who has not tasted it does not comprehend it. In 5 different manners the ignorant may search for the self by lifting up the skandhas, but they fail to see it, while the wise one sees it and is thereby released. Even by means of knowledge, illustrations, and other things, one is unable to gain an insight just into the siddha. How can one then gain an insight into the signification accumulated in it? Not understanding that individuation is due to one mind, the reasoning ones cling to the view that there is no cause, there is no evolving. The yogin sees into the mind and the mind is not seen in the mind, the seeing is born of what is seen, and of what cause is the seen born? These passages are to be carefully weighed. For if otherwise they dangerously verge on the doctrine of an individual ego substance which is persistently denied by Buddhists, Mahayana as well as Hinayana. The main idea is that there is a principle of consciousness from which the whole Vijnana system evolves and is set in operation, but which is not to be regarded as something individual residing in the 5 skandhas. Ordinarily, this principle unknown, invisible, and beyond the grasp of the sense Vijnanas is taken for an ego. An unenlightened people try to locate it in the body just as they try to take hold of the pleasant notes that issue from the lute, or of the effective, curative agency that is hidden in a medicinal herb. Apart from the lute, the sound is non-existent. So with the curative quality, it does not exist outside the herb itself. The presence of the principle is to be realized inwardly by intuition and not by a process of analysis. This intuition, in other words, the wisdom of non-outflowings, constitutes the original nature of the mind which is described in the above quotations as originally pure. If this is considered something concrete and individual, something separable from and capable of being picked out among objects of particularization, saying, here it is, this will be resorting to dualistic discrimination which is condemned so much in the Lankavatara. At all events it is evident that there was historically a close connection between the ego idea and the evolution of Alayavijnana. The following noted stanza quoted whenever there is an allusion to the philosophy of the Yogacara is taken from the Chinese Sandhi-Nirmakana Sutra. The Adana-Vijnana is deep and subtle, where all the seeds are evolved like a stream. I do not elucidate this for the ignorant, for they are apt to imagine it an ego substance. When siddha among early Buddhist scholars came to denote accumulation, vijnana, discrimination, or representation, and manas, deliberation or reflection, it was natural for the later psychologists to designate siddha as alaya or alayavijnana as belonging to the general body of various vijnanas. Alaya means storage or treasure house, where all the results, called seeds, of one's mental and physical activities are hoarded, i.e. accumulated, and it does not stand outside the Vijnana system. It is one of them though in the most fundamental sense of the express zion. And for this reason the Alaya is liable to be regarded as the ego substance, the very idea against which Buddhism has been fighting ever since its inception. The Lankavatara is thus quite anxious to dispel this confusion. In what follows the Buddha answers the question of Mahamati as regards the identity of Atman and Tathagata-garbha, which, as was mentioned before, is the same as Alayavijnana. There is no doubt that this idea of Alayavijnana or Vijnana or Tathagata-garbha or Siddha caused confusion in the minds of some Mahayana Buddhists who have been brought up in the teaching of Anatman. Hence the following question proposed by the Bodhisattva Mahamati. The Tathagata-garbha is mentioned in the text of a sutra and described as thoroughly pure and undefiled in its essential nature, as endowed with the 32 marks, entering into the physical body of a sentient being, and enveloped within such matter as the skandhas, dhatus, and ayatanas, and soiled with the dirt of greed, anger, folly, and discrimination, but really described by the Buddha as eternal, permanent, auspicious, and unchanged. If so, is not this Tathagata-garbha something of the same order as the Atman in the teaching of the philosophers? They teach the Atman as eternal, creator, devoid of attributes, mighty, and imperishable. To this question raised by Mahamati and also cherished by most bodhisattvas and scholars, the Buddha gives the following answer. O Mahamati, the doctrine of Atman by the philosophers is not the same as my teaching of the Tathagata-garbha. For what the Tathagatas teach is emptiness, limit of reality, nirvana, no birth, no appearance, no desire, and such other conceptions, with which the Tathagata-garbha is characterized, and by which the ignorant are saved from the occasion of cherishing a sense of fear about the Buddhist teaching of non-ego. And they are thus finally led by the Tathagatas to the realm of no discrimination and no imagery, that is, to the entrance of the Tathagata-garbha. O Mahamati! Bodhisattvas-Mahasattvas of the present and the future are warned not to entertain any idea of ego substance here. This explains how the Buddha came to talk about the Tathagata-garbha and how it differs from the ordinary notion of the ego. With the philosophers, the ego does not rise above the level of empiricism. The existence of the transcendental ego as maintained by Buddhists, which apparently contradicts their traditional view of non-ego, is hard to understand for the ignorant as well as for those of the two vehicles. For especially the latter are used to interpret existence in terms of transitoriness or momentariness. This leads to the question how the Alaya or Tathagata-garbha is to be conceived in relation to the doctrine of universal transitoriness. Is not the Tathagata-garbha, however skillfully it may be expounded, after all a sort of ego substance? It now becomes necessary for the Lankavatara to discuss the problem of momentariness in relation to the hypothesis of Tathagata-garbha. This has partially been touched elsewhere. And let it suffice here to quote the following stanzas, which are by the way wrongly placed after the paragraph on the 6 paramithas instead of before it in all the texts of the Lankavatara. Existence is discriminated by the ignorant as empty, transient, and momentary, and the nature of momentariness as they discriminate is illustrated by a stream, lamplight, and seed. But really nothing is seen working at any moment, all is solitary, there is no birth and destruction, nothing is ever born. This is the Buddha's view of momentariness. Birth and death follow each other without interruption. This is not the teaching of the Buddha for the ignorant. That birth and death are uninterruptedly successive in all things is due to discrimination moving on in all the paths of existence. With ignorance as cause there is the evolving of all mental activities. But where do they get their anchoring while there is no birth of form? An uninterrupted continuity breaks and there evolves another mind. While form has not yet been set up, depending on what will it mind be evolved. As long as the mind is evolved depending on it, the cause is not the true one. Not being sufficient in itself as a cause, how can one know of anything that suffers destruction momentarily? The attainment of the yogins, gold, the Buddha's relics, and the mansions in Abhasvara heaven, these are indestructible from any worldly cause. Permanent are the truths attained and the knowledge realized by the Buddhas. Permanent is the bhikshu nature and his attainment. How is momentariness seen here? Visible objects are like the Gandharva's castle, Maya, and other such like non-entities, and no momentariness is here. The elements are not realities, and how can we speak of their power to create? I have said that the Alaya and the Tathagata-garbha are one and the same thing, and that one is more of psychological significance than the other. But the LṳNG-GIA sometimes seems to distinguish one from the other, that is, to consider the Alayavijnana as presenting the impurity phase of the Tathagata-garbha. Read the following, which also sheds a side light on the question of the ego. Mahamati asks, "Tell me, O Blessed One, concerning the evolution and disappearance of the skandhas, tatas, and ayatanas. If there is no Atman, what is it that is evolved and disappears? The ignorant who, stationing themselves on things that are evolved and disappear, do not think of extinguishing pain, may not seek after nirvana. They must therefore be enlightened on the subject." Whereupon the Buddha answers, "The Tathagata-garbha contains in itself causes both good and not good, and from which are generated all the paths of existence. When there takes place a revulsion in the Alayavijnana by gradually ascending the steps of Bodhisattvahood, a man will no more be led astray by the methods and views of other philosophers. Then stationing himself on the stage of Bodhisattvahood known as the immovable, he gains the passage leading to the bliss that accrues from the 10 kinds of samadhi. Supported by the Buddhas in samadhi and reviewing the wonderful truths taught by the Buddhas as well as his own vows which he made in the beginning of his career, he does not abide in the limit of reality absorbed in the bliss of samadhi. He has realized the supreme state in his own consciousness. And by the methods of discipline that do not belong to Sravakas and Pratyekabuddhas and philosophers, he gains the path belonging to the holy family of Bodhisattvas at the 10th stage, and also the will body of knowledge which is above all conscious strivings after a samadhi. For this reason let the Tathagata-garbha known under the name of Alayavijnana be _purified by those bodhisattvas who are seeking after something distinctive. O Mahamati, if there is no Tathagata-garbha known under the name of Alayavijnana, no evolution, no disappearance will ever take place. But there is, both among the ignorant and the wise, evolution and disappearance. While abiding in the bliss that accrues from the enjoyment of the actual life and supreme state realized in their consciousness, the yogins do not abandon their discipline and hard laboring. O Mahamati, this realm of Tathagata-garbha Alayavijnana is pure in its original nature indeed, but appears devoid of purity because of the false views and reasonings entertained by all Sravakas, Pratyekabuddhas, and philosophers, which defile the light by their external defilements. This is not the case with the Tathagatas. As to them, they see the Tathagata-garbha as if it were an amalaka fruit in their own palm. O Mahamati, I inspired Queen Srimala1 and also other bodhisattvas who are endowed with a fine, subtle, pure intelligence to expound in a text of discourse the meaning of the Tathagata-garbha known under the name of Alayavijnana, so that the Sravakas, who are attached to the Alaya's evolution with the 7 Vijnanas, might see into the egolessness of things. The realm of Tathagatahood which was elucidated by Queen Srimala under the inspiration of the Buddha is not the domain of reasoning which belongs to Sravakas, Pratyekabuddhas, and philosophers. The realm of Tathagatahood indeed belongs to another realm where the teaching that the Tathagata-garbha is the Alayavijnana is understood. And this is meant for the Bodhisattvas-Mahasattvas who like yourself being endowed with a fine, subtle, penetrating intellect and understanding know how to conform themselves to the meaning. And not for those other philosophers, Sravakas and Pratyekabuddhas, who are attached to words and texts of instruction. Therefore, O Mahamati, may you and other Bodhisattvas-Mahasattvas have a thorough understanding as to the realm of all Tathagatahood and the teaching that the Tathagata-garbha is the Alayavijnana so that they may discipline themselves in this and not remain contented with mere listening to the teaching. False discrimination, no birth, and causation. Enough has already been said about the LṳNG-GIA's conception of habit energy or memory and the principle of individuation. Let us now proceed to see what is meant by discrimination and in what relation this stands to the doctrine of mind only, and also to the Buddhist idea of no birth which is characteristic of the transcendental Siddha. The following quotation may be illuminating. Inspired by the spiritual power of the Buddha, Mahamati asked him again, What is the distinctive feature of the Buddhist doctrine of no birth and no annihilation? For do not all the philosophers teach also that the creative agents are neither born nor annihilated? Which corresponds to the Buddhist teaching that akasa, apratisamkhaniridha, and nirvalidatu are not subject to birth, nor to annihilation. The philosophers too describe the world as having been produced by causation in the hands of creators, while the Buddha describes the world as being born depending upon ignorance, desire, karma, and discrimination. Whether creation by causation, or dependence, the difference is in names only.